They fined me $250,000 for living on my own land. What they didn't know was I owned the ground beneath their entire neighborhood. The morning it all began was quiet, too quiet for what was about to unravel. The sun had just risen over the rooftops, casting that thin, golden light that makes everything look almost innocent, almost untouched. Birds were chirping in the trees that lined the cul-de-sac, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted faintly in from the neighbor's lawn. If someone had asked me then how I thought the day would go, I would have said, like any other. But it wasn't like any other. It started with a white envelope. It was taped to my front gate with blue painter's tape, neat and deliberate, like someone wanted to make sure I couldn't possibly miss it. The paper itself was thick, almost official, and the words stamped across it in black bold letters nearly made me laugh the first time my eyes landed on them. Notice of violation, $250,000 fine. At first, I chuckled under my breath. It had to be some kind of prank. Maybe a neighbor with a twisted sense of humor. Maybe some kid with access to a printer and too much time on his hands. But as I pulled the envelope free and unfolded the letter, the weight of it hit me. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, was accusing me of nearly a dozen violations. Unapproved fencing, unsightly landscaping, unauthorized exterior modifications, non-compliance with aesthetic regulations. The list stretched on, each item marked with the kind of legalistic jargon that made my head pound. When I got to the total, I froze. $250,000. $250,000. The laughter that had bubbled up in me vanished instantly, replaced by something colder, heavier. My stomach dropped, and my pulse quickened, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I stood there, letter trembling in my hand, trying to make sense of it. The ink was sharp, the formatting precise, and the signatures. At the bottom were real, president of the HOA, treasurer, secretary. Not forged, not fake. They weren't joking. The HOA was dead serious. At first, denial tried to take hold. This has to be a mistake, I muttered aloud, scanning the letter again. No way this is for me. They must have mixed up the addresses. But there was my name, my property lot number, my street address, all printed clearly at the top. There was no mistake. That's when the anger started to seep in. Who did they think they were? Charging me $250,000 for what? For planting my rose bushes 2 feet outside the approved zone? For painting my back fence a shade darker than their stupid color palette guidelines? For letting my grass grow half an inch taller than their precious regulations during the summer drought? It was absurd. It was insulting. It was war. I carried the letter into my kitchen and slapped it down on the counter. The sound echoed through the empty house. My coffee sat half-drunk on the table, now cold, forgotten. I pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, staring at the letter like it might explain itself if I glared long enough. I thought back to the last HOA meeting I'd attended. It had been 6 months ago, in that stuffy little clubhouse near the community pool. The board members had sat at the front, smug and self-important, flipping through their binders while half the neighborhood pretended to care. I remember the HOA president, a man named Gerald Whitman, with his slicked-back hair and fake smile. He always spoke as if he owned the entire subdivision, his voice dripping with condescension. "You'll find, ladies and gentlemen," he had said that night, "that our property values are only as strong as our ability to enforce standards. If one homeowner slips, we all pay the price." At the time, I'd roll my eyes. Now, reading the letter in my kitchen, his words came back to me like a threat. By noon, word had already spread. My phone buzzed with texts from neighbors. "Hey, I heard you got fined. Is it true they're hitting you with 6 figures? Man, what did you do to piss them off?" I didn't reply. Let them gossip. Let them speculate. I wasn't about to explain myself through text messages. Instead, I drove down to the HOA office that afternoon. The building was tucked behind the tennis courts, a squat little structure with white siding and dark shutters, like a miniature courthouse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and toner, and the receptionist barely looked up from her computer as I stormed in, letter in hand. "I need to speak to someone about this," I said, slapping the violation notice on the counter. Her eyes flicked to the bold title, then up at me. She gave a small, Practice smile. One moment, please. I'll see if Mr. Whitman is available. Of course it was him. 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from Gerald Whitman in his cramped office. The walls were lined with plaques and certificates, all praising his dedicated service to the community. His desk was neat to the point of obsession, every pen aligned, every paper stacked in precise order. He looked at me like I was dirt under his shoe. "Mr. Hayes," he began smoothly, folding his hands. "I assume you're here about the notice." "Assume?" I snapped. "You hit me with a $250,000 fine. You're damn right I'm here about the notice. What the hell is this?" He didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk grew wider. "The board reviewed your property during our last inspection cycle. We found numerous violations. Serious ones. You've been warned multiple times." "Warned?" I barked out a laugh. "You mean those little pink slips you stuffed in my mailbox about the color of my shutters? That's your idea of a warning? And now you jump from that to, what? Ruining my life with a fine bigger than my mortgage." "Mr. Hayes," Whitman said calmly, "we don't decide the fines. The bylaws do. And you signed those bylaws when you purchased your property." I leaned forward, my fist clenched. $250,000. For what? For a damn fence. He raised an eyebrow. "Among other things. And frankly, if you can't maintain your property according to community standards, perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you." I wanted to lunge across the desk. I wanted to wipe that smug grin off his face. But I held back, forcing myself to breathe. Instead, I stood. "This isn't over." "I'm afraid it is," Whitman said softly. "Unless you pay." Driving home, my mind spun. Every part of me burned with rage, but under it all was something else. Something deeper. Because here's the truth they didn't know. The HOA thought they held all the power. They thought they could bury me under fines, humiliate me in front of the neighborhood, push me out of my own home. But I had something they didn't. Something none of them had ever bothered to research. This neighborhood, these streets, these cul-de-sacs, these manicured lawns and gates and mailboxes sat on land that had been in my family for generations. And when the developers came knocking decades ago, when they carved up parcels and laid down pavement, when they built this community from the ground up, there had been one condition written into the deeds. A condition my grandfather had insisted upon. A condition no one remembered, except me. And as I pulled into my driveway, the letter crumpled in the passenger's seat. A grim smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. They thought they owned me. They had no idea. This was only the beginning. The sound of tires crunching against my gravel driveway broke the mid-morning silence. I stepped out onto the porch just as a black SUV pulled up, followed closely by a silver sedan. Doors opened in unison, and out they came, like a procession of self-appointed royalty. At the front was Greg Wallace, the president of the HOA. His gait was slow, deliberate, and dripping with smugness. His two board members trailed behind him like obedient knights. Sandra Miller, the treasurer, with her ever-present clipboard clutched like a weapon, and Peter Lane, the secretary, who always looked as though he was smelling something foul. They didn't knock. They didn't ask permission. They marched straight up my driveway like it was their personal red carpet, their shoes clicking in arrogant rhythm. Greg stopped just short of my porch, squinting up at me as if he owned not only my house, but the air I was breathing. His lips curled into a smirk that I had grown to despise long ago. "Morning, Hayes," he said, his voice oily smooth, like a salesman who knew he was about to swindle you. "Thought we'd come by and make this simple for you." Sandra adjusted her glasses and scribbled something on her clipboard, already itemizing my supposed sins. Peter sniffed disdainfully, glancing at my freshly trimmed hedges like they were weeds in a landfill. Greg's smirk widened. "Pay up, or we'll take your property." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. My fists tightened to my sides. It wasn't just the arrogance of the demand. It was the audacity to stand on my driveway, on my land, and talk about taking it as if it were theirs for the plucking. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let my silence stretch, forcing Greg to bask in the sound of his own voice. He mistook my quiet for intimidation, his smirk deepening, his chest puffing out as if he'd won. Behind him, Sandra and Peter exchanged a look, half smug, half cautious. They were enjoying this little show, but they weren't as bold as Greg. Sandra's pen tapped nervously against the clipboard. Peter shifted from foot to foot, trying too hard to look important. Finally, I stepped off the porch and onto the driveway, closing the distance between us until I was standing only a few feet away. Greg's smirk faltered just a fraction, but he held his ground. "You think you can take my property?" I said quietly, evenly, my voice low enough to force them to lean in. "You think you can stroll up here and intimidate me with your little entourage and your fine print? But let me tell you something, Greg. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." For the first time, the smirk flickered. Neighbors had started to gather. It was the curse of suburban living. Nothing happened without an audience. Curtains shifted. Doors cracked open. A couple across the street stood on their lawn, pretending to water plants while clearly eavesdropping. A teenager lingered by his bike at the corner, phone in hand, recording. Greg noticed too, and instead of backing down, he turned to face the audience. He spread his arms dramatically, playing to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. "This man refuses to comply with community standards. He thinks he's above the rules that we all agreed to follow. And now he wants to threaten the HOA itself instead of doing what's right." There were nods from some neighbors, murmurs of agreement. But others frowned, uneasy. People liked order, but they didn't like bullies. I smiled thinly. "Funny thing about rules, Greg. They only work when they're written legally. And you'd be surprised how much you've overlooked." That got his attention. His smile froze for half a second before snapping back into place. I remembered the first time I'd ever seen Greg Wallace at an HOA meeting. He hadn't always been president. Years ago, he was just another face in the crowd. Eager, ambitious, the kind of man who licked boots until he climbed high enough to start shining his own shoes. He'd worked his way into power by out-talking, out-bullying, and out-scheming everyone else on the board. I remembered the way he laughed when a widow asked for an exception to build a wheelchair ramp for her husband. "Slippery slope," he had said, smiling as he denied her request. I remembered how he fined a single mother because her children's bikes were left on the lawn overnight. I remembered how he ordered a neighbor to repaint their shutters twice because he didn't like the shade of blue. Greg Wallace didn't enforce rules. He weaponized them. And now he thought he could weaponize them against me. Sandra finally spoke, her voice sharp and clipped. "Mr. Hayes, this is your last chance to settle. Pay the fine. Remove the unapproved structures. Fix the landscaping violations. Failure to comply will result in legal action, up to and including seizure of property." Her words were rehearsed, legalistic, the kind of script she'd recited countless times before. But she didn't understand. None of them did. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only the three of them could hear. "You think you own this neighborhood," I whispered, "but you don't even know who you're standing on." Peter frowned. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" I straightened, my smile sharp. "It means you've just opened a door I've been waiting years to walk through." Greg scoffed, but I could see the uncertainty now, a flicker of doubt behind his eyes. He covered it with arrogance, puffing his chest again, waving his hand dismissively. "You've got 30 days, Hayes," he said, voice loud again for the crowd. 30 days, or we'll bury you in court. Enjoy your little house while it lasts." He turned sharply, motioning for Sandra and Peter to follow. They strutted back down my driveway like kings returning to their castle, their arrogance on full display. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, because their arrogance had just given me what I needed. They thought they'd cornered me, but in reality, they just unlocked the first move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. And I had been preparing for this moment for years. The drive to the county records office was quiet, but my mind wasn't. The road stretched long and flat beneath the late morning sun, yet all I could hear was the echo of Greg Wallace's voice. "Pay up, or we'll take your property." Those words burned in my head like acid. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, every mile bringing me closer to the one place I hoped would hold the answers. My grandfather's voice came back to me then, low and steady, from years ago. "Paper lasts longer than memory, son. When men forget, the ink remembers." I hadn't understood what he meant back then. But now, with the HOA breathing down my neck, I finally did. The county records office sat at the edge of downtown, an aging brick building that had seen better days. The front steps were worn from decades of feet, the flagpole leaned slightly to the right, and the glass doors rattled when I pulled them open. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the faint smell of dust, ink, and paper, a smell of history buried in file drawers and forgotten binders. Behind a long wooden counter sat a clerk, a thin man in his late 60s with round glasses perched at the end of his nose. He looked up from his computer as I approached, eyebrows raised. "Help you with something?" he asked. "Yes," I said, pulling the folded letter from my pocket. "I need to look up property records. Old deeds. My grandfather's name was Walter Hayes. He owned land here decades ago." The clerk squinted at me, then at the name. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe, but it passed quickly. "Basement archives," he said. "You'll want the boxes from the Hayes collection. Second row, third shelf. Can't miss it." The basement was cooler than upstairs, and darker too. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across rows of metal shelving. Dust hung in the air like a ghost that never left. I walked down the aisle, my shoes echoing against the concrete floor, until I found it. Hayes. A row of battered cardboard boxes with my family's name scrawled across them in fading black marker. For a long moment, I just stared at them. These weren't just boxes. They were my family's story, my inheritance, the foundation of everything I thought I knew about the land I lived on. And yet, until that moment, I'd never truly dug through them. I pulled the first box down and set on a table. The cardboard groaned under the weight, and when I lifted the lid, a puff of dust rose into the air, making me cough. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, brittle maps, thick manila folders held together with rusted metal fasteners. Hours slipped away as I combed through them. There were land surveys dating back to the 1940s, black and white photographs of rolling fields before the subdivision existed, and legal documents stamped with seals so old they were crumbling. Some were written in my grandfather's neat, slanted handwriting. Others bore signatures of men long dead, county commissioners, surveyors, developers. I traced my fingers along one map in particular, its edges frayed, its ink faded but still legible. It showed a massive parcel of land stretching far beyond where the subdivision now stood. At the bottom was a familiar signature, Walter Hayes. As I dug deeper, I found something else, an old leather-bound ledger tucked between folders. I opened it carefully, and there were notes in my grandfather's hand, page after page. Developers eager to buy. Won't sell without conditions. Land divided, but mineral rights retained. Insert clause regarding reversion if HOA formed without owner consent. My eyes widened. Reversion clause? Hua Gonsen? My pulse quickened as I flipped through the pages faster. And then, at the bottom of one page, in underlined ink, ownership of underlying land remains with Hayes family. Structures leased. Not sold. I froze. Not sold. Leased. I read it again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. My grandfather hadn't just sold off parcels of land for development. He'd structured it differently. The houses, the sidewalks, even the community facilities had been built, but the land beneath them, the soil itself, still belonged to the Hayes family. I pulled another document, a thick deed stamped by the county registrar, and scanned the fine print. There it was buried in legal language. All parcels developed hereunder shall be considered leasehold improvements, subject to the ultimate ownership of the landholder, Walter Hayes, and heirs. My throat went dry. I didn't just own my house. I owned the entire subdivision. Every sidewalk, every yard, every cul-de-sac, even the gleaming HOA clubhouse where Greg Wallace liked to strut around like a king. The weight of the discovery hit me all at once. My knees felt weak, and I had to sit down. For years, the HOA had bullied me, fined me, tried to control me. But the entire time, the ground they walked on, the very soil beneath their manicured lawns, was mine. The arrogance of Greg Wallace flashed through my mind, his smug grin, his threats to take my property. He had no idea. None of them did. They thought they held the leash. In reality, There were tenants, squatters, standing on land that belonged to me. And the best part? I had the papers to prove it. But along with the surge of triumph came something else, a flicker of caution. This wasn't just leverage. It was a nuclear weapon in a neighborhood war. If I moved too soon, too carelessly, they might bury me in legal countermeasures, drown me in court filings, drag this out for years. I needed to be smart, calculated, just like my grandfather had been. I closed the ledger slowly, my fingers trembling slightly, and placed it back in a box. Then I pulled out my phone and took photographs of every critical page, the clauses, the maps, the signatures. My evidence, my shield. As the afternoon sun slanted through the basement windows, I packed the documents neatly, sealed the box again, and stood. My chest felt lighter than it had in days. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid. Walking back to my truck, I looked around at the streets of the subdivision stretching out before me. The sidewalks where kids played. The pristine lawns people bragged about. The clubhouse where the board held their little kangaroo courts. It all sat on my land. And now I knew it. The game had changed. Night had fallen by the time I spread the papers across my dining table. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the wood. The boxes from the county records office sat half open beside me, their contents spilling out like the guts of some ancient beast. In front of me lay the deed. Not just any deed, the deed. A brittle sheet dated 1954, stamped with the seal of the county recorder's office. Its ink faded, but still sharp enough to sting. I'd already read it 3 times, but I read it again, each word heavier than the last. Buried deep in the fine print, beneath paragraphs of legal jargon about easements, setbacks, and mineral rights, I found it. A single sentence. A clause so carefully placed it was practically invisible unless you knew to look for it. Any charter, covenant, or association arising upon the herindescribed property shall be valid only upon the continued, express consent of the landowner and heirs. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding in my chest. There it was, the key. The HOA's entire existence, its charter, its authority, its so-called rules, wasn't freestanding. It was a house of cards, propped up on the consent of the landowner. And that landowner was me. I stared at the words until they blurred. I felt like I just unearthed a loaded weapon that had been buried for 70 years, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Memories of my grandfather washed over me. I saw him at the old oak desk in his study, cigarette smoke curling in the lamplight as he scrawled notes in the margins of papers. I heard his gravelly voice, patient but sharp. Developers will promise you the world, but they'll take it the second you're not looking. That's why you put the land in writing, boy. Not for you. Maybe not even for me. For the ones who come after. At the time, I'd been too young to grasp the weight of his words. But sitting here now, with the deed under my hands, I understood perfectly. He hadn't just sold land. He'd laid a. The implications spun in my mind like a storm. The HOA thought they ruled me. They thought their fines, their threats, their charters, their smug little board meetings gave them power. But legally, they were puppets, and I was holding the strings. If I withdrew my consent, their charter dissolved. Their bylaws became meaningless. Their authority evaporated overnight. They weren't the rulers of this neighborhood. I was. I pushed back from the table and began to pace. My bare feet whispered against the hardwood floor as the weight of the discovery settled deeper into my bones. I imagined walking into the next HOA meeting, dropping the deed on the table, watching Greg Wallace's smug expression curdle into horror. I imagined Sandra's clipboard slipping from her hands, Peter's pen freezing mid-scratch. But no, revenge wasn't about storms. It was about shadows, patience, precision. My grandfather hadn't built this clause for a dramatic outburst. He'd built it as leverage, as control. If I played this right, I wouldn't just destroy the HOA. I'd make them kneel. I sat again, drawing the papers closer, studying every inch. The language was airtight. No loopholes, no wiggle room. My grandfather had been meticulous, anticipating every angle. The clause didn't just cover residential lots. It extended to all improvements, structures, and associations formed upon the land. That meant the clubhouse, the pool, the manicured entrance with its brick sign proclaiming the subdivision's name. Every inch of their little kingdom was mine. A low laugh escaped me before I realized it. The sound was strange in the empty house, half disbelief, half triumph. But with triumph came responsibility. I knew Greg Wallace. He wasn't the type to roll over when confronted. He was the type to fight dirty, to dig, to claw, to manipulate. If I revealed my hand too soon, he'd drag me into court, rally the board, spin the narrative to the neighbors. No, this wasn't about revelation. This was about control. I needed to move quietly, deliberately. First, confirm the clause with a lawyer, someone who understood property law down to the bone. Then gather the neighbors. Not all of them, just enough to fracture Greg's support. And finally, wait for the moment Greg overreached again. Because he would. He couldn't help himself. That would be when I pulled the trigger. I ran a hand over the brittle paper, imagining my grandfather doing the same all those decades ago. Did he know how close we'd come to losing it all? Did he know that one day his grandson would be sitting here, using his foresight as a weapon against men like Greg Wallace? Maybe he did. Paper lasts longer than memory. And tonight, his paper had given me something stronger than memory. It had given me power. I walked to the window and looked out at the subdivision stretched before me. Porch lights glowed faintly. Sprinklers hissed in the distance, and the neat rows of houses sat quiet under the stars. To the world, it was just another neighborhood. But I knew the truth now. Every yard, every mailbox, every patch of grass, even the damn sidewalks. Mine. And when the time came, they'd all remember it. The cicadas hummed in the trees as the board marched up my walkway. The air was thick with summer heat, sticky and heavy, but the real weight pressing down was the arrogance radiating from Greg Wallace and his little entourage. Sandra clutched her clipboard like a shield. Peter carried a leather folder, the kind of accessory meant to look professional but only made him look rehearsed. Greg, of course, wore that same smug grin I'd come to loathe, the grin of a man who thought he owned everything he touched. I'd invited them here, not to negotiate, not to plead, but to let them hang themselves with their own rope. The porch boards creaked as they stepped up. I gestured to the chairs I'd set out, the old wooden ones that had been my grandfather's. They hesitated, as though sitting would make them equals. Eventually, Greg lowered himself into the center chair, spreading his arms across the sides like a king settling onto his throne. Sandra sat rigid, lips tight. Peter glanced nervously at me, then at Greg before taking his seat. I remained standing for a moment, letting them feel the imbalance. Then I sat slowly, deliberately at the head of the little circle. Between us, on the table, sat a neat stack of papers bound in a weathered leather folder. Greg leaned forward, his grin widening. You called this meeting. What? Finally realized paying up is easier than fighting us. His tone was oily, practiced. He wanted to project confidence, but there was a flicker in his eyes, impatience, maybe, or curiosity. I folded my hands calmly on the table. You find me $250,000, I said, my voice steady. On my land. Greg didn't even blink. He tilted his head slightly, as if speaking to a child. Yes. And as we've said before, failure to comply will result in liens, foreclosures, and eventual seizure of your property. The rules apply to everyone, even you. Sandra nodded stiffly. Peter scribbled something in a notebook. I let the silence stretch. Let them stew in their own smugness. Then, with deliberate slowness, I reached for the leather folder. I placed it on the table and opened it, revealing the brittle deeds, the copies, the stamped documents I'd spent nights poring over. Their eyes followed the motion. Greg's smirk faltered just slightly. I slid the top document forward. Funny thing about those rules, I said softly. They only exist if the landowner consents. Greg frowned, glancing down at the paper, but not reaching for it. Sandra leaned forward, trying to read the faded ink. Peter's pen stopped moving. I tapped the clause with one finger. The sentence that had slept for 70 years, waiting for this moment. Any charter, covenant, or association arising upon the herein described property shall be valid only upon the continued, express consent of the landowner and heirs. The silence was immediate and thick. The cicadas outside seemed to quiet. Sandra blinked. What is this? I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. This is the deed. Recorded in 1954. My grandfather's land. My inheritance. Your entire HOA is built on it. Which means your charter, your bylaws, your authority. I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. Only exist if I say so. Peter swallowed hard, eyes darting between Greg and me. His knuckles whitened around his pen. Sandra's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at Greg for direction, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. Greg, for once, didn't speak immediately. His jaw tightened, his smile struggling to survive on his face. He finally forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. This is ridiculous. Some ancient document doesn't override modern governance. The HOA is recognized by the county, by the state. I slid another document forward. A certified copy, notarized and freshly pulled from the county recorder's office. Recognized? Yes, but conditional. The condition being my consent. Withdrawn consent means no charter. No charter means HOA, which means I leaned forward, voice dropping like a hammer. You're trespassing on my neighborhood. That was the moment their faces drained of color. Sandra's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered against the porch floor. Peter's lips moved soundlessly, like a man realizing the ground beneath him had just collapsed. And Greg's face told the whole story. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his tan skin pale, his smug grin twisting into something between disbelief and rage. You can't just... I can. I cut him off, voice calm as steel. And I will. You find me $250,000. You threaten my home, my land, my family's legacy, all while standing on ground that doesn't even belong to you. I pushed the deeds closer, the brittle paper whispering across the table like a blade drawn from its sheath. The only reason you've had power here is because my grandfather allowed it. Because I allowed it. That ends tonight. The air was electric. Sandra sat frozen, her clipboard now forgotten. Peter looked like he might be sick. Greg tried to speak, but words failed him. He sputtered, gestured, slammed a fist against the arm of his chair. This won't. He stumbled over his own words, the polished, lawyerly tone cracking into raw fury. You think you can just undo decades of governance with a piece of yellow paper? I tilted my head. Not undo. Expose. Without my consent, there's no governance. Without the landowner, there is nothing. I let the silence hang again. Then I stood slowly, towering over them on my own porch. So here's what happens now. You walk off this property. You take your fines, your threats, your little charters, and you burn them. Because the HOA is finished. And if you don't, then the next meeting won't be on this porch. It'll be in court, with a judge who will laugh you out of the room before I finish my first sentence. No one moved at first. The cicadas had returned, buzzing louder than before, like nature itself was bearing witness. Finally, Sandra stood, her chair scraping sharply against the porch. She didn't say a word. She just gathered her papers with shaking hands and turned toward the steps. Peter followed, pale and silent, clutching his notebook like a lifeline. Greg remained seated, fists clenched on the arms of the chair, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. He stared at me, as though sheer hatred could undo the truth written on those pages. You'll regret this, he hissed finally, his voice low and venomous. You don't know what you've started. I leaned down, meeting his glare with a calm, steady gaze. Oh, Greg, I said softly. I know exactly what I've started. And then I straightened, pointing to the steps. Get off my land. Greg stood slowly, the chair groaning under the sudden release of his weight. He gathered nothing, no papers, no dignity, just turned and stalked down the steps after his board. I watched them go, their silhouettes shrinking against the twilight. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispers already spreading. They had no idea what had just shifted in their world, but soon they would. I closed the folder, my grandfather's legacy safe, once more. And for the first time since that cursed fine had appeared on my gate, I allowed myself to breathe. Not in relief, in triumph. Because tonight, The balance of power had flipped, and the war had only just begun. The county clerk's office smelled faintly of dust and ink, the kind of place where history didn't just sit in books but lingered in the air. I walked in with a folder tucked under my arm, the same leather-bound collection of deeds that had turned Greg's smug grin into ash on my porch. But tonight wasn't about private confrontations. Tonight was about putting the law into motion. The clerk, a woman with sharp glasses and a sharper voice, raised an eyebrow as I set the papers before her. She leafed through them, the crackle of old parchment loud in the quiet office. Her expression shifted from skepticism to surprise, then to a kind of wary respect. "These," she said softly, tapping the claws with her pen, "are airtight. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." I nodded. "All I need is for them to be filed and served. Certified copies to every property under the subdivision. Every single one." She stamped the first page with a heavy thud that echoed like a gavel. The sound wasn't just procedural. It was the sound of a new era beginning. 2 days later, the letters went out. I'd chosen thick, cream-colored envelopes, official in appearance, but different enough from the HOA's familiar stationery to catch attention. The return address was mine. No pretense, no disguise. Inside, in plain legal language, the truth was spelled out. Your lease agreement with the HOA is invalid. Effective immediately, the charter no longer holds authority on these grounds. All obligations previously directed toward the Homeowners Association are hereby void. As the rightful landowner, I will be issuing new agreements. Any payments are payable directly to me. This notice supersedes any and all prior arrangements. It was direct, it was final, and it was undeniable. By the end of the week, every mailbox in the subdivision had carried that letter, and the neighborhood exploded. I heard it first from Mrs. Callahan, the widow across the street who'd lived here since before the HOA even existed. She waved the letter at me from her porch, her face lit with a kind of glee I hadn't seen in years. "It's about time someone shut those crooks down," she shouted, cackling like a child. Later, at the corner cafe, whispers swirled so thick they practically stuck to the walls. Homeowners leaned over steaming cups of coffee, letters spread between them like treasure maps. "They can't do this, can they?" one man asked nervously. "Looks like he already did," his neighbor replied. "My God, Greg must be furious," someone else chuckled. Some people were panicked. Others were relieved. A few, like Mrs. Callahan, practically threw a celebration on their lawns. But the common thread was clear. The HOA's grip was slipping, and everyone knew it. Greg's reaction came swiftly and predictably. By the third day, the HOA sent out their own letters, hastily written and dripping with denial. Illegal. Fraudulent. Ignore it once. That was the best they could muster. I watched as neighbors stood in their driveways comparing envelopes, weighing the embossed seal for my certified filing against Greg's flimsy, photocopied notices. The contrast spoke louder than any argument could. And for the first time, I saw doubt flicker across the neighborhood, not toward me, but toward him. The gossip spread like wildfire. At night, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, listening to the hum of voices carried on the summer air. Porch lights flickered on, clusters of people gathered, arguments rose and fell. Some cursed my name, some praised it, but all of them spoke of me. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone felt it. One afternoon, a group of younger homeowners approached me directly. They were cautious, but curious. "So, does this mean we don't owe the HOA anymore?" one asked. I smiled faintly. "It means you never did. They just convinced you otherwise." Their eyes widened, and I knew in that moment the spell was breaking. Of course, Greg didn't take it quietly. I caught sight of him storming from house to house, his voice raised, his arms gesturing wildly. He was trying to rally support, but the more he shouted, the more he looked like a desperate man clawing at sand as it slipped through his fingers. Once, I saw him pounding on the Callahan's door, his face red, sweat staining his collar. When Mrs. Callahan finally opened, she simply held up my letter, smiled sweetly, and closed the door in his face. Greg's roar of frustration echoed down the street, and I allowed myself the smallest of smiles. But beneath the satisfaction, there was something else: awareness. Greg wasn't going to stop here. His pride, his control, his reputation, they were bleeding out before his eyes. And men like Greg didn't just fade quietly. They lashed out. They schemed. I thought of my grandfather again, the man who had penned that clause in 1954. Had he known this day would come? Had he anticipated men like Greg, intoxicated by power they never truly owned? The more I turned it over, the more I believed he had. The clause wasn't just legal foresight. It was a trap, a safeguard, a weapon disguised as ink. And now, decades later, I was the one wielding it. The neighborhood was no longer ruled by the HOA's hollow authority. It was ruled by me, not with fines, not with threats, but with the truth of ownership. And as I watched Greg pace and sputter, his empire collapsing with every opened envelope, I realized something. This wasn't the climax. This was only the eviction notice. The real reckoning was still to come. The courthouse loomed over the square like a fortress of stone, its white columns gleaming under the morning sun. People had gathered on the steps, neighbors, reporters, even a few county officials curious to see what had drawn so much noise from one quiet subdivision. Greg arrived in a tailored suit, flanked by his board members and a slick-looking attorney with a grin as sharp as a knife. They strutted past the murmuring crowd, heads high, as if walking into their coronation. Me? I walked in alone. No entourage, just a folder of deeds under my arm, the same papers that had turned the neighborhood upside down. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low voices. Homeowners filled the benches, clutching copies of my letter, their eyes darting between me and Greg. For years they'd watched him strut, threaten, and find them into submission. Today, they were here to see if he could back it up in front of a judge. The bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. And just like that, the battle began. Greg's lawyer, a man named Dalton Pierce, rose first. He was everything Greg wasn't. Charming, polished, calm. He spoke with the smooth assurance of someone used to winning. Your Honor, what we have here is a frivolous claim. This man, he gestured toward me, is attempting to dismantle decades of established community governance with a dusty clause from 1954. The HOA is recognized by the county, the state, and the courts. Without it, property values will collapse, chaos will reign, and homeowners will suffer. Murmurs rippled through the benches. Greg sat smugly, nodding along, his arms folded across his chest. I remained still, silent, waiting. Dalton continued, voice dripping with contempt. This is nothing more than a stunt. My client has spent years maintaining order in that neighborhood. He has protected property values, ensured safety, and enforced rules that keep the community thriving. To suggest that all of that can be undone by one man's signature on an ancient deed is not only absurd, it's dangerous. He sat down with a flourish, confident he had already won. The judge turned to me. Mr. He glanced at the docket. Mr. Carter, your response. I stood slowly, feeling every pair of eyes in the room on me. My voice was calm, steady without theatrics. Your Honor, this isn't about property values or safety or community order. This is about ownership, who holds the land, and who holds the authority that flows from it. I set the folder on the table, opening it carefully. The deeds, old but meticulously preserved, caught the light. My grandfather purchased the land in 1954. In the deed, he included a clause. Any charter, covenant, or association arising upon the herein described property shall be valid only upon the continued, express consent of the landowner and heirs. That clause has never been revoked, which means the HOA's authority has always been conditional. And that condition ends now. I handed certified copies to the bailiff, who carried them to the bench. The judge flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing, then lifting in surprise. This is notarized, recorded, binding. Dalton shot to his feet. Objection. Outdated legal relics, irrelevant to modern governance. The judge raised a hand sharply. Sit down, Mr. Pierce. The gavel came down once, the crack echoing through the chamber. Greg leaned forward, his face flushed, his voice breaking into the silence. He's twisting history. This neighborhood exists because of the HOA. Without us, none of this works. None of it. The judge fixed him with a glare that could have frozen stone. Without the land, Mr. Wallace, you don't exist, and the land belongs to him. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The only sound was the faint rustle of papers as the judge set the deeds down. Case dismissed, he said firmly, slamming the gavel a second time. The HOA has no authority. Land ownership is clear. This court recognizes Mr. Carter as the sole rightful authority over the property in question. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, neighbors whispering, some smiling, others wide-eyed in shock. Sandra, one of Greg's board members, looked like she might faint. Peter simply stared at the floor, his hands trembling. And Greg's jaw hung open, his face a storm of disbelief and fury. His empire had just been demolished in a single sentence. I gathered my papers calmly, tucking them back into the folder. As I turned to leave, I glanced at Greg. His eyes met mine, burning with hatred, with humiliation, with a promise of retaliation. He wasn't just powerless. He was finished. But as I walked past him, I couldn't help but notice something else in his gaze, something dangerous. Greg Wallace wasn't going to go quietly, and I knew the real war was only just beginning. The fall of an empire doesn't always come with explosions, fire, and chaos. Sometimes it comes with silence, an eerie quiet that settles over a place when the people who once barked orders suddenly lose their voices. That was exactly what happened in my neighborhood after the judge's gavel struck the final blow. The once mighty HOA that had bullied, fined, and controlled everyone's lives crumbled faster than even I expected. At first, there was confusion. Greg Wallace, the arrogant president who once strutted across lawns like he was a feudal lord, tried to salvage the wreckage. He called emergency board meetings, sent panicked emails, and even tried to post new fines on doors. But now, his threats carried no legal weight. Every time he opened his mouth, people laughed. Greg, my neighbor Sarah whispered one afternoon as we watched him pacing the clubhouse parking lot, red-faced and shouting at no one in particular. He looks like a king without a crown. I nodded. Correction, a king without land. The irony was sharp and delicious. The board members began to scatter like rats leaving a sinking ship. First to quit was Laura, the treasurer, who once prided herself on tracking every dollar squeezed from the homeowners. Without legal standing, she realized the funds she had been guarding weren't worth the paper they were recorded on. Rumors spread that she had shredded stacks of financial documents in her garage before resigning. Then came Frank, the vice president, who used to write violation slips just to spite neighbors he didn't like. I saw him one morning hastily loading his SUV with boxes from a clubhouse. When a group of neighbors approached him, asking what he was doing, he muttered something about personal belongings and drove away without looking back. The rest followed. Within 2 weeks, the entire HOA board was gone, scattered like ashes in the wind. The visible collapse of their authority became most apparent when the signs began to come down. Those smug "No parking," "No fencing," and "All yards must be approved" signs, once symbols of oppression, stood like relics of a defeated regime. And one by one, they were ripped from the ground, not by me, but by the very residents who had once lived in fear of them. I'll never forget the day Mr. Henderson, the old veteran with the neatly trimmed hedges, took a crowbar to the sign in front of his lawn. People gathered around, cheering as the metal pole bent and cracked. 30 years, he muttered, his arms straining as he pulled it free. I've been told what I can and can't plan in my own damn yard. The crowd clapped, some even whistling. For the first time in decades, freedom rang in the sound of steel hitting pavement. Then came the locks. The HOA clubhouse, once a fortress of smug meetings and backroom plotting, was mine. Legally, it sat on my land. I had the right to change the locks, and I did. I remember the morning clearly. A locksmith stood by the heavy double doors, his drill buzzing as Greg and a few loyalists screamed at him from the sidewalk. "You can't do this," Greg shouted, his voice cracking. "This is HOA property." I calmly unfolded the deed in front of him, tapping my finger against the legal description. Correction, this is my property. The locksmith smirked and handed me the new keys. The doors clicked shut, and just like that, the seat of their power was sealed off forever. The gossip spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. At first, there was uncertainty. People weren't sure who to believe. But then, as the days turned into weeks, the reality became undeniable. The HOA was gone. The only authority left was me, the landowner. And the same neighbors who once ignored me, whispered about me, or even signed the HOA's complaints against me began to change their tune. It started small. Mrs. Peterson, the widow who lived 2 houses down, knocked on my door one morning with a plate of fresh-baked cookies. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly, her eyes moist. "For years, they fined me because my grass wasn't green enough. They even threatened to take my home when my husband passed. Now, I can breathe again." I accepted the cookies with a polite smile, though inside, I felt the irony. The same people who once stood by as the HOA tried to crush me were now seeking my approval, my forgiveness. And they weren't alone. Families I barely knew began to show up with pies, casseroles, bottles of wine, anything to get on my good side. I'd walk outside and find neighbors waving eagerly, offering handshakes, their earlier hostility erased by desperation. Because deep down, they all knew one thing. I held the future of the neighborhood in my hands. Greg, however, refused to accept defeat. I saw him once, weeks after the collapse, standing at the entrance of the subdivision with a clipboard, trying to convince people to rebuild the HOA under new management. But no one listened. Cars passed him without stopping. A few rolled down their windows just to laugh. One teenager even shouted, "Hey Greg, maybe you should mow your own lawn for once," before speeding off. The man who once held absolute sway now stood humiliated, reduced to begging. For me, the collapse was more than just revenge. It was vindication. I remembered the night I first found that white envelope taped to my gate, demanding $250,000 for violations. I remembered the humiliation, the rage, the disbelief that they thought they could strip me of what was mine. And now, as I sat on the porch, sipping coffee while the neighborhood buzzed with new freedom, I realized my grandfather had left me more than deeds and land. He had left me the power to dismantle tyranny. The collapse of the HOA wasn't just the end of their reign. It was the beginning of a new era. An era where I decided the rules. And the rules were simple. This land was mine, and no one would ever take it from me again. I renamed the streets, tore down their petty rule boards, and opened the community lake to everyone. Kids laughed, dogs ran free, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. I hadn't just beaten the HOA. I had freed an entire community. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet. I sat on my porch, an old mug of coffee cradled in my hands, listening to the distant laughter of children echoing across the neighborhood. The sound carried differently now. It wasn't weighed down by fear or surveillance, by the oppressive eyes of the HOA watching from their clubhouse window. No, now it was pure, unfiltered joy. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and let my eyes wander across the land that stretched in every direction. It wasn't just a subdivision anymore. It was something deeper, something almost sacred. Every sidewalk, every strip of grass, every fence that once bore the stamp of approval or rejection of the HOA now stood free. And all of it, legally and rightfully, belonged to me. I thought back to my grandfather, the man whose name was etched on the yellowing deeds that had once gathered dust in a forgotten cabinet. He wasn't a loud man, nor a vengeful one, but he was wise enough to see decades into the future, wise enough to plant safeguards into the very foundation of the land itself. In 1954, when he scribbled those clauses into the paperwork, I doubt he could have imagined the monstrous rise of HOA power, the arrogance of men like Greg Wallace, or the suffocating control they would wield over ordinary families. But somehow, some part of him must have sensed it. And when the time came, when the arrogance of the HOA tried to crush me under a $250,000 fine, it was his foresight that saved me. The truth hit me with the weight of legacy. I hadn't just won a personal battle. I had upheld my grandfather's vision. The neighborhood itself transformed in the weeks and months after the HOA's collapse. Lawns that had once been required to be identically manicured now blossomed into individual expressions of freedom. Some families planted wildflowers. Others painted fences bright colors or installed quirky yard art that would have once drawn immediate fines. Instead of looking uniform and sterile, the community began to look alive. Even the air seemed lighter. Where there had once been tension, neighbors reporting neighbors, fines being whispered about, resentment simmering, there was now cooperation. People borrowed tools, traded vegetables from gardens, and helped one another rebuild. It wasn't perfect. Some lawns grew wild, some fences leaned crooked, some driveways were cluttered with too many cars. But that was the beauty of it. For the first time in years, people were allowed to be themselves without fear of retribution. And every time I saw a smile or heard laughter where once there had been silence, I felt my chest swell with pride. Greg Wallace, meanwhile, had vanished into obscurity. I heard rumors. Some said he moved out of state. Others whispered he was trying to file lawsuits in some desperate attempt to reclaim power. But none of it mattered. Without the land, without authority, he was just another man shouting at shadows. The neighborhood had already moved on. One quiet evening, Mrs. Peterson, the widow with the cookies, stopped by again. She sat with me on the porch, gazing at the sunset. "You know," she said softly, "when my husband died, they fined me 3 times in a single month. Said my grass was uneven. Said the flowers I planted weren't approved. They made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home." Her voice wavered, but she smiled at me. "But you gave his place back to us, to the people. That's a legacy, you know." I looked down at the coffee in my hand, silent for a long moment. I didn't feel like a hero. I hadn't set out to save anyone. All I had wanted was to protect what was mine, to stop the wolves from tearing me apart. But in doing so, I had given the entire community back its freedom. Maybe that was the true inheritance my grandfather had left me. Not just the land, but the responsibility to guard it. Seasons passed. Summer heat gave way to crisp autumn evenings. Winter blanketed the roofs in white, and spring brought blooms of color no HOA could have ever approved. And through it all, I remained on my porch most evenings, sipping coffee or sometimes whiskey, watching the land that was mine stretch out before me. The laughter of neighbors never grew old. It was the sound of victory, the sound of freedom. One night, as the stars flickered to life overhead, I whispered into the quiet air, "They fined me $250,000. The words hung there, sharp and absurd. Then I chuckled to myself. But I ended up owning their world. The irony was almost poetic. The very weapon they had tried to use against me had become the sword that cut them down. Their arrogance had unlocked the door my grandfather had sealed decades ago, and I had stepped through. Now, whenever I hear neighbors laugh freely or see children riding bikes without fear of being told their helmets weren't the right color, I know one thing with absolute certainty. This land is mine forever. Not just in paper and ink, not just in courts and deeds, but in spirit. It carries my grandfather's legacy, my struggle, and our community's freedom. And as long as I sit on this porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops, I will guard it, because I'm not just a homeowner. I am a landowner, and no HOA will ever rise here again.